With me is Daniel Thym, professor for international law at the University of Constance. Mr. Thym, the current government says that migration is on a good path, that migration numbers are going down, and that it is fully committed to the new EU Migration Pact. At the same time, just down the road from here, the likely incoming coalition is debating rejecting people at the border. Which is the most effective way to get migration under control?
What I find quite remarkable is that both the outgoing government and the incoming government have the same objective. It's bringing down numbers. That's now the new consensus in Germany, which has taken in so many migrants and refugees over the past decade that more or less everyone agrees we want less migrants. And if you ask me, it's not so much an either-or question. The common European asylum system, the EU asylum reform, will have an impact, but most experts will tell you that it will not be the real game changer. So I think it's fair for the next government to say, yes, we will implement the European rules, but at the same time, they are pushing for more reform, for a second round of reform. And that is something which the Christian Democrats, which so far in the opposition, are pushing. So expect the new German government to really insist on a sort of EU asylum reform plus on a second and next step.
Friedrich Merz, the likely next chancellor, is going further than that. He says essentially on day one, he would implement rejections at the German border. Can he do that legally? Because his likely coalition partner says that's tricky.
That is tricky indeed, and it's very difficult to give a definite answer. There are some arguments in support of refusal of entry at the border. There are many other legal arguments who oppose it. And at the end of the day, it will be up for courts to decide. That's also why I'm telling politicians, whoever want to listen to me, that they should use your refusal at the border at a short-term measure for selected groups of people only, and that they should really think ahead and think about ways how to limit migration and change asylum reform thereafter. And that has to be a European response. But if you are in Brussels, if you talk to representatives of other governments in the European Union, there are many governments who are saying we are ready to talk about new asylum policy. And if the new German government says, okay, we are willing to join that group, there might really be a window of opportunity for a new asylum policy, which might be much stricter than the current one.
Some critics say that Germany was part of the problem, at least as much as part of the solution in finding a European path in the past. Is that true? And do you expect that to change?
Well, it depends on what you define as the solution. And that goes back to what I said at the very beginning. If you say the problem is that the numbers are too high and that you want to reduce the numbers, then indeed the political position of the outgoing German government, the old government, made the achievement of that objective more difficult because they insisted on safeguards, they insisted on being less strict. But if your objective is to take in more people, to protect more refugees, then actually the position of the old government was the right one. So it depends very much on how you defined the solution. But the majority in Brussels, at least among national governments, is probably on the restrictive side. They were stricter than the old German government. So in a way, you are totally correct. If Germany becomes stricter, they will inevitably support a stricter approach at the European level.
Why are numbers that currently are pointing downward not a success that is likely to stay in the current geopolitical context?
There are several reasons. The first one is that the numbers have gone down because many European countries within the European Union and beyond have adopted very strict policy on the Western Balkans, but also in the central Mediterranean. Italy has a very strict cooperation with Tunisia, and Tunisia prevents the people from coming. And it's very likely that sooner or later the numbers will go up again, quite simply because Europe is surrounded by countries which are politically quite unstable, countries which are also insecure, and sooner or later there will be new conflicts like the one in Sudan or in Ukraine at the moment, who will push more people towards Europe. We also have climate change, so it's very likely that sooner or later the numbers will go up again, and then at the very latest you will have a debate about a fundamental revision of European asylum legislation.
How fast could such a fundamental revision take place?
Normally, debates in Brussels take years. So we talk about literally years. The last debate took 8 years. But in theory, that can go quite quick. During the financial crisis 15 years ago, and also during the COVID pandemic 5 years ago, laws were adopted as a matter of weeks. So it really depends on the sense of political urgency which politicians in Brussels and also national capitals are feeling. If there is the desire to move forward swiftly, decisions can be taken swiftly.
A lot of the time, the rise of right-wing parties like Marine Le Pen's party in France, but also the far-right AfD party, which just doubled in its share here in parliament in Germany, is cited as that very urgency. The new migration pact is due to come into force in 2026. So is time running out for the European parties of the center to act?
They have little time left. And looking back, it's really a problem that it took us 8 years to adopt the last reform. If that reform had been adopted in 2019, it would have been implemented 3 years ago. We might have seen some effects by now. So it's a real problem that it took so long. And that creates now a sense of urgency. But my advice for politicians would be patient, remain patient, try to look for short-term measures which buy you time, which you can then use to do the long-term reforms. And if you follow the debate in Brussels, you will hear many of these short-term measures which politicians want to implement to buy time. And one of the most favorite issues is what in Brussels is called innovative solutions. It's asylum procedures in third countries, such as the Italian centers in Albania or the British project to have asylum procedures in Rwanda. That is one of the initiatives which in Brussels at the moment is gathering a lot of support and attention. And that's one potential way how governments can buy time in the short term. But that is not a long-term solution. So in the background, they need to really work on a fundamental new reform.
What are your expectations? What will in the end come out of these coalition talks? Because there is speculation and talk that the conservative CDU-CSU might want to have the possibility to strip people of German citizenship if they have a second citizenship. But also there's much debated rejections at the border. How much of this do you actually expect to happen?
A few days ago, a background paper was leaked, which seems to be correct. And according to this background paper, refusal of entry at the border, rejection at the border is already agreed politically. So that will be done. And for me, the big question mark is for how long will it be done and how systematically will it be done? Because they also say we want to do that in coordination with neighboring states. And that is a very vague and open formulation, which I hope will be used by the incoming government to really start negotiations with neighboring states, with partners in the European Union, to really lift the debate to the European level, where then we might see a fundamental reform of European asylum policy. And the my expectation is that this reform will make the asylum policy more strict than the last reform adopted last year.
So you expect real new momentum there? I just want to pick out one concrete example because Poland, which neighbors Germany, has already started implementing a 60-day exemption on asylum rights. What kind of signal does that send, and how effective do you expect that to be?
Well, that is a policy which is very controversial because, as you will probably know, and as some of the listeners will know, there Poland, Lithuania, and also Finland accuse Belarus and Russia for instrumentalization migration to destabilize European countries. So they say the government in Minsk and also the government in Moscow is allowing people to enter Belarus and Russia with a tourist visa and then to move forward to Europe. And they are blocking this because they say it's a sort of warlike scenario. They are using migrants like weapons. That's the language which is now being used in Brussels. And that would normally be a violation of European asylum legislation. But to my great surprise, the European Commission, that is the executive in Brussels, has given political and also legal support to the government in Poland in particular, that it's an exceptional scenario where an emergency provision in the European treaties can be used to set aside EU legislation. So it's really also legally very, very controversial. There are already court cases pending. And if the courts conclude that the Polish practices are illegal, then you will definitely have a debate at the European level about changing the European Convention of Human Rights, about amending possibly even the Refugee Convention. So that is a very, very critical development, which has really the potential of changing asylum policy in Europe in the long run. And if that then comes together with German refusals of entry at the border, with German rejection of asylum seekers, as it's called in German, at the German border with Poland, with the Czech Republic, with Austria, that would add to this political momentum of governments who are calling for a fundamental revision of European asylum legislation, even of human rights treaties. So I personally expect the next years to be very hectic politically, and European politicians starting asking some very fundamental questions about the right to asylum. Because I'm a law professor, and in a way, I find such a debate more honest and also better for the rule of law than an American debate, where Donald Trump is just disrespecting court orders. That I do not want to happen, and that's why I also consider it appropriate to have a debate, and then we can listen to the political pros and cons of the different positions. But that is a debate which is probably forthcoming in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe.
Daniel Thym, professor for international law and one of the leading migration experts here in Germany. Thank you so much.